Thank you, Scott, and good evening, everybody. Always nice to be here and kind of back in the normal routine after the holiday patterns. I kind of find comfort in the same things each week, and including this webinar. So always happy to be here. One of the topics that I wanted to talk about tonight, or the topic I want to talk about tonight, is something has showed up a lot with our clients lately. It's a universal thing that addicts struggle with sometimes in recovery, is reframing validation, where they get their good vibes from the world. And I think a lot of us grew up seeking validation externally. And I think for me, just to summarize, recovery is about moving that process to more of an internal one, where we can generate the validation ourselves without really having to rely on it elsewhere. But let me back up a little bit. So validation, what is it? What do we need? Why do we have it? You know, this starts early, especially in the lives of addicts, where there's a lot of what we call adverse childhood experiences of trauma, where people get mixed messages about who they are. And very often the family and the childhood environment they're in tends not to be supportive. So there may be a lot of critical messaging, you know, that leave the child believing that they're unlovable or unworthy or somehow less than perfect or somehow flawed, basically. And this is the root of shame that we see elsewhere, and we'll talk elsewhere about that in addiction. But tonight, it really also impacts this validation. One of the strategies that kids do, and this is not a conscious thing, but it just evolves because we need it as human beings, is we start to look for outside ourselves for that. If the messaging from our caregivers and our parents and our families and our churches and schools and the laws and all these other forces have been to minimize our worth, then we start to kind of try to counterbalance that somehow and look for it, or we try to compensate. And we may compensate by creating what some people call a false self. I create this image, carefully curated image of myself for you, so that you'll like me and you'll approve of me. And so I may be a perfectionist. I may work really hard. I may go to the gym and build my body up so it's you know, something. I may achieve a lot. I may go for a high dollar income to make myself feel good. I may drive a certain kind of car or live in a certain zip code. These are all things that we do that are external sources of validation, none of which in themselves are wrong, but it's just if we rely on that to know that we're okay, that's when it gets to be problematic. And the problem with most addicts is that we're in that cycle. It's very difficult to sustain it. We start to believe, because those negative beliefs seem to be a bottomless pit, that there's not enough reassurance in the world to make us feel okay about ourselves. And so this is a cycle that we have to really confront in recovery, because it's that kind of constantly seeking validation from a pretty woman or from somebody that we want to approve of us, or from a father figure, or whoever it is. That's not a good recovery strategy, because it's going to really just contribute to a lot of our addiction. So that's kind of what we start to need to learn how to accept and change. And I think that's what I kind of wanted to talk about when we spend our lifetimes chasing validation and acceptance and never quite feeling like we're getting it. You know, how can we provide that for ourselves? How can we turn the tables on that? The consequence of this, by the way, is that many addicts, if not every addict, really doesn't know who they are. You know, if I'm constantly trying to please you or mold myself to what I think you're going to like, after a while, I lose touch with who I am. I lose touch with what I really want. I lose touch with how I'm feeling, because I'm so busy reading and reacting to the outside world that I kind of get disconnected from me inside. And this is one of the first really important tasks that we start right in the beginning of Seeking Integrity, is really kind of, let's go inside and let's try to connect and figure out this terrain. You know, what are these feelings? And first of all, what is a feeling? How am I feeling it? And where do I experience in my body? Just trying to connect these the basic landscape of this stuff, so we can start to work on it. But the bottom line is that in early recovery, most people don't know what they need. Most people don't know what they want. Most people really don't understand what they're feeling. It's a lot of confusing time. The other thing is that we often get enmeshed with others. You know, if we start to depend on others for caretaking, for approval, for balance in our lives, to know that we're okay. We can get dependent, we can get enmeshed, meaning poor boundaries. We don't hold our own. We don't hold other people to their own boundaries in certain circumstances. So you can see the whole situation kind of unravels. So this quest for self-validation that I'm trying to make a case for tonight, how do we find reassurance without having to rely on a certain dollar income, or going trips to the gym, or a body, or plastic surgery, or whatever, the car we drive? How can we feel good about ourselves without all that? And again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but if that's our only source of validation, that's when I think it becomes a problem. So a couple of things I want to talk about as kind of recovery steps that we can do in this. One is that we really have to try to transition to relying on other people to validating us, to be able to validate ourselves. In other words, in a bad situation, if I'm feeling uncertain, if I'm feeling shame, if I'm feeling like I've just made a terrible mistake, do I have the ability to kind of re-regulate myself, to kind of rebalance, to know that, yeah, David, that was a stupid thing to do, but people make mistakes and you can learn from it and you can try better, whatever. There's corrective ways where we could be gentler with ourselves than I think we often are. So I think learning how to define ourselves on our own terms. We feel there's some benefits for this, by the way. We feel increasingly more connected with others. The guys in the unit get tired of me saying, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, the opposite of addiction is connection, but connection really is the game here. And the more robust social support network we can have, the better chances we can stay sober. And that is really reliant on being true to ourselves and understanding who we are, and not people pleasing, not looking for a peer group, not looking for all the cool kids in the A meeting to like us, whatever dynamic from elementary school translates into recovery rooms. We have to really kind of be careful about that. So, but the bottom line is, if we can do this, we start to feel really increasingly connected with others. We're stronger, and this is with time. We can as we start to feel better about ourselves and kind of know ourselves better, we can start to have an increased awareness or acknowledge parts of ourselves that we don't really like as much, that may need work. And I think this is a really important step too, because if we're in that place where we're trying to correct for a lot of internal negative core beliefs, like I'm not enough, or I'm worthy, or I'm unlovable, or full of shame, it's very hard to then go to other areas that I don't really care for, or that need work in myself, and admit I have that. Oftentimes we just defend, but the more comfortable I am in my own skin, the more comfortable I am recognizing, hey, I have these talents and I have these problems, and and that's human, right? But to recognize that whole more realistic picture allows me to work on those issues, because very often in early recovery, I am so terrified of somebody noticing some flaw that I think I have, or making a mistake, or dropping into shame, or not doing something perfectly, that I'm going to be all closed up and not really willing to admit that maybe this is an area I need to work on. So we get some humility, I think, along the way. We also, by the way, the converse of that is we can accept our strengths, right? We see that, yeah, I'm pretty good at this. Maybe I'm pretty good at conversation, or I'm good at writing, or I'm a good friend, or I'm a good listener, or whatever it may be. But I think we get a much more realistic view of who we are, and the things that really do give us value and validation. So what I'm saying, I guess, is that this allows us to step out of our comfort zone. When we're seeking external validation as our sole supportive validation and nourishment, it really gets problematic, because there's never enough. But I think if we're providing ourselves, suddenly we're much more in control of the supply and the demand, and we can really auto-correct and self-correct when things happen. And that allows us to really move much more freely in and out of our comfort zone. In psychology, we talk about a window of tolerance where we can operate in relative comfort without being kind of pushed out of our comfort zone. I think if we can start to internally validate ourselves, that window of tolerance gets much bigger. There's much more room to kind of maneuver in terms of who we are and how we see ourselves. We can, and then a couple other things, and I'll stop. When we're in addictive mode, I think we're very much in a survival mode, right? Survival mechanisms very often, if only to protect our addiction. But we can slowly kind of go out, move away. I think once we start to know that we're okay and can self-validate, we can drop some of those old survival mechanisms, whether it's the dependency on other people, the people pleasing, the need to be perfect, the need to disregard any negative feelings about ourselves or deny parts of ourselves. All these things get much more realistic and balanced. And I think we can really start to make better choices, right? And in terms of the people we choose to be around, because if we feel okay about ourselves, we may be able to understand that certain relationships, whether in recovery or not, may not be as good for us as some others. And we have a better choice and better control over that. We make better choices. And then the final thing, and this is, I think, the great gift of this, if we can transition to more internal self-validation, we really start to believe that we are enough. And I think that belief for an addict who probably is wired to believe they're never going to be enough, in recovery, at least for me, was one of the greatest gifts. Like, I'm okay, I'm enough as I am. Do I have work to do? Yeah, but it's a really reassuring and I think grounding place to be. So I think with that, I will stop. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, David. Type some questions into the Q&A feature and we'll answer any questions you have about external versus internal validation or anything else to do with addiction and recovery. We have one left over from last week that I'm going to jump to in a second. I do want to make a quick announcement. David, you mentioned enmeshment is one of the ways that we try to get validated somehow. A week from tomorrow, January 12th at 11:05 a.m. I know that's very specific, but 11:05 a.m. on January 12th, John Taylor is going to do a special webinar on mother enmeshed men. And lots of sex addicts qualify as mother enmeshed men. Lots and lots of relationships are impacted by mother enmeshment. We're going to be focusing entirely on that next Thursday, 11:05 a.m. with John Taylor. It's his normally scheduled webinar, but John is one of the experts on enmeshment and covert incest. So we're excited to be doing that.
That's exciting.
A week from Thursday. Just so you know, David, when you talk about the opposite of addiction is connection, the guys hear it and they often quote it to me when I'm doing sessions with them. So,
and they don't roll their eyes? Okay.
So they do hear it and it does sink in. And it really is the truth also. I just want to validate that. Since we're talking about validation, I will validate that, yeah, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. No question. You also mentioned, and this is my question here, that ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, which we sometimes use as shorthand of ACEs, they create our negative core beliefs and they push us towards seeking external validation because our negative core beliefs are basically shame. I'm not good enough, I'm unworthy, I'm unlovable. So we look for validation elsewhere. As we combat basically low self-esteem and this constant search for external sources of validation, does it help if we go back and identify the original source of that? If we go back and find the trauma and oh, this is something I was told, and that's why I believe, does it help us overcome this? Or does it just make things worse?
I think, in my experience, it's always useful to work specifically on those old dynamics that created that belief, to get some resolution. That can take the form of trauma therapy or just regular talk therapy. But I think it really it sheds some light on that, and I think it allows the person to not at least fall back into the negative core belief as easily if they understand it. I will say in that regard, though, changing these, it's easier said than done, because I think they're very embedded and kind of hardwired into our brain, and we have to really practice affirmations and other and corrective beliefs about ourselves to really stick. It can be done, and it's breaking a habit is what it is. It's a thought habit, but yeah. But I think to your specific question, I think yes. And when we understand what's going on, ultimately it can help. Now, is that essential to get relief? No. I mean, I think that a lot of times I've worked with clients who, have no memory of anything before 5 or 6 years old, and which to me, to a therapist, is kind of an indicator of trauma or something going on when there's no memories at all. But those are the years in which these beliefs are formed. So the person may never be able to access kind of the circumstances or the dynamics by which that was formed. And that's not essential to change it or heal from it. But I think it's useful to have that background information for sure.
Yeah, and then I have one other quick question. You mentioned one of the things we need to do is learn to identify our feelings and the needs under them. One of the complicating factors that I run into all the time, and I know you do as well, is particularly with addicts of all types, but particularly with male sex addicts, which is what we primarily treat, is we were told that we were not allowed to have feelings. And we certainly weren't allowed to express them as children. So we discounted them. And how does that play into our lack of, or our inability to validate ourselves? And how does that complicate the process of crawling out of that hole?
It's a really, really good point, Scott. I sometimes talk, to the guys in the unit about man rules and how men, especially in our country, are socialized and those beliefs that you name, right? We shouldn't have feelings. We should just we are kind of trying to solve problems and not really talk and process so much, just jump to some solution, and much of the frustration of our partners oftentimes. But I think, yeah, that idea of being able to carry on and go forward with that is really important for sure.
Thank you. Shall we jump into the Q&A here?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. This is from last week. Can you elaborate more on how chronic bullying can lead to longer term addiction? In my recovery process, most people I've interacted with have had big trauma events, like big T trauma, but I don't remember having any of those. However, I think I did have chronic bullying and emotional neglect, because most people I've talked to have had big trauma events. I don't remember having big events. So I feel shame about not having the big T trauma, but having the little T trauma, but yet here I am an addict. I mean, the question goes on for a while, but that's the short version. What's the difference between big T trauma and little T trauma? Where does chronic bullying fall into that? And why would people feel shame about not having big T trauma, but still being an addict?
Right. So I think it started with EMDR, which is a kind of trauma therapy that I do and many other people do. But there was this differentiation between big T trauma and little T trauma. And it really goes to the notion of what people think trauma is. And of course, when we think of trauma, when the general public thinks of trauma, I guess, we think of really major disasters, right? A war injury in Afghanistan, or a terrible car accident, or a natural disaster. I live in Florida, the west coast of Florida last year with the hurricane. I mean, having your whole home and community wiped out. Those are capital T traumas, right? Obviously, and that can result in PTSD and other kinds of stress and trauma related problems. What we found in the last, 20 years is that other kinds of things that are traumatic, but at more of a low intensity and more chronic degree, can also create that. So it may not be a single event that you can point to and you remember, where you were exactly when something happened, but it's more of a chronic thing like bullying. And we know that the stress of that, the anticipation of it, the kind of the chronicity of it, even though any single bullying event won't rise, hopefully, to the level of a car accident or a war injury. What we know just from research over time, that has a cumulative effect, and it's a cumulative effect that can result in trauma and PTSD even. So I think it's a different frame, but we're understanding that these lowercase traumas are equally valid. Neglect being another one. Neglect meaning a lack of parental attunement or emotional connection or support, doesn't mean that I didn't if I say I'm neglected, it doesn't mean I didn't have food or shelter or clothing or a car or whatever, but it means that my parents kind of didn't show up for me. They didn't tell me they loved me. They didn't show up at my, I was going to say games. For me, it was more like High School Musicals, but whatever activities you would hope parents would show up at, they weren't there. That's neglect. That's very difficult for somebody, because when they look back at their childhood, and this goes to your point, I'm going to talk about shame in a moment. They look back at their childhood and think, well, I had nothing bad happened. I wasn't assaulted. I wasn't abused. I wasn't anything. Why would I have this? And very often neglect is the culprit, because we can't see it because it didn't happen, right? But it's something that wasn't there. And so that's really something to pay attention to. People feel shame about that. It's like, okay, why am I an addict? Why do I have all these low self-esteem, low, bad core beliefs? For no reason. I didn't have something bad happen to me, when that may not be the case. But I think sometimes when that shame appears, it's because we just don't feel that it kind of feeds that we were not enough, and that there's something really wrong with me. And if I can't get a clear path on why, or an understanding of why I ended up this way, then I think our default sometimes is shame. We blame ourselves. And I think that's a unhealthy instinct that addicts have. Not that we're not responsible for ourselves and responsible for our actions, but I think addicts are created from several different sources, right? There's genetics, but there's certainly social factors and family involvement and other kinds of things as well. But I think shame is our kind of go-to place. And if we have some questions about why am I this way, we'll probably end up somehow feeling some element of shame.
Yeah, there's a great book on neglect called Neglect the Silent Abuser by Enid Gray, E-N-O-D, I believe, Gray. Might be
Beautiful book. Yeah.
Terrific book. So if you want to learn more about neglect and its impact, Neglect the Silent Abuser. This is so timely. Thank you. I'm a betrayed partner, and my husband has been in recovery for the last 18 months. He's doing 12 steps, group work, CSATs, trauma work. What are some of the things I should be able to observe or experience that show he is now better able to validate himself internally versus externally? Feels like instead of unhealthy APs, I'm going to assume that's fair partners. He is now getting validation in therapy and groups, but I'm not sure the self-validation is there, which still creates safety concerns for me. Interesting question. So what does self-validation look like to somebody on the outside?
Yeah, so this essential, switch, right, from depending on other people to really moving inward. I think it takes time, because these patterns are so deeply ingrained and they're so automatic. And I think what you're seeing, and the time frame you mentioned of 18 months, I think it does take time to move to more healthy sources of external validation. I guess if I were to break down the steps, like a therapist, like a sponsor, like peer groups, like people in recovery, as an example, those people might be better sources of kind of corrective validation on the way, hopefully, to internalizing it. I think what I would look for are just behavioral things, right? I think people who are starting to feel more internally validated are less emotionally dependent on other people. They're less irritable. I think there's less mood swings sometimes, because they're may or may not be getting what they want from outside themselves, or they may be frustrated they're not getting enough. So I think there's more of a balanced mood feeling. I think the irritability and blaming that we sometimes see, where we kind of talk about a sex addict as in kind of a dry drunk of recovery, that really, I don't see those behaviors in somebody who's really internally validating themselves. And basically there's this sense of okay. I would finally mention there's the things I talked about a little bit in my bullet points, where people start to be able to tolerate discussing negative things about themselves or painful things about themselves. They can go there. They can talk about it. They can admit it. They can feel it. And I think this ability to acknowledge things we've done, good and bad, is really important for that. So there's subtle changes. I think people become basically better partners. They become more less moody, less up and down, less blaming. They're owning behavior, taking responsibility, and basically feeling fairly good about themselves, including asking for help, asking for things when they really need it. And I think one of the differences when people are internally validating is that when they're not, they're constantly seeking validation from outside themselves. When that's less of the norm, when they're more internally validating, there's far less of that. And when they do, and they should, when they need it or need to talk about, especially with their partner, then I think it's much more useful and in-depth discussion as opposed to kind of a superficial give me some validation back. So these are subtle changes, I know, but I think I would expect to start to see them. And I think honestly, the timing is perfect for this because at 18 months, people are still in transition, right? But they hopefully have learned to get good feedback from people. The other thing that happens, by the way, and it takes a while, I'd say 12 to 18 months, is that I may have a therapist or a peer or a sponsor or a friend or a spouse who gives me wonderful feedback, and that's accurate and healthy. But if I still internally believe that I'm unworthy, unlovable, not good enough, there's that wonderful feedback from those people falls flat, right? It's hollow because it doesn't match my own internal experience. And so I have to change how I feel about myself in order to really hear validation, healthy validation from outside myself. And along with that then comes this, hopefully, ultimately, the skill to be able to say to myself, yeah, you did a good job, or you're okay, or you do deserve this, or whatever validation we may need at any given time.
Thank you. Next one here, my sex and porn addict partner's teenage daughter is showing concerning behaviors. She has messages and flirtations going on with at least a dozen guys. She doesn't know, but we can see her messages, so who knows how many total, et cetera, et cetera. 4 of those guys appear to be exclusive long-distance relationship, and she's telling them she's going to get a plane ticket this summer to go visit. She doesn't have a job, isn't old enough to fly on her own anyway. She has engaged in questionable activity with grown men. She is narcissistic in many ways, especially with lies and a huge ego. She grew up being told she was cuter and better than everyone else. There are definitely boundary and enmeshment concerns with her dad, the sex and porn addict, as well as with her grandma. The biological mom is a whole other issue. The daughter is showing what appears to be parental alienation toward her dad and the person asking the question here. The daughter sees a trauma therapist, but they don't seem to be getting anywhere. What do you recommend? There's a lot there.
There's a lot there. I was just trying to read it and get the bullet points here. Well, first of all, a teenage girl who isn't old enough to even fly, having these kind of in-depth conversations with men, talking about going to see them and exclusive relationships. And, this to me is a kid who's been kind of sexualized and should be seeing a trauma therapist and seeing a therapist. There's some, and I don't know if it's related to her father and the addiction in the past, but I think there's some, boundary issues. There's some self-esteem issues, and we're talking about external validation. It sounds like this young woman is really hot on the trail of seeking external validation from other guys. And this is a really worrisome pattern, because I think unless it's interrupted, there's going to be even further problems, because when this young woman can get out and be somewhat more independent or break away, I can see a lot of self-destructive potential there in terms of other acting out behaviors and so on. So I'm glad she's in therapy. I don't know if the trauma therapist is somebody who has experience with adolescence. Adolescence is a whole different thing in terms of therapy. I don't have expertise in that, so I wouldn't want to see a client like this myself, and that trauma therapist may be in the same boat. But I think somebody that understands the dynamic of addiction and enmeshment and how families, and especially children, can be affected by this, is really important, because honestly, when we look at this intergenerational dynamic with addiction, it gets passed from father or mother to daughter and son, one generation after the next after the next. And I would guess probably that her father, the now sex and porn addict in recovery, has, probably had similar behaviors, right? And so my goal here would be to interrupt this behavior and this young woman, and to give her some insight, and that may take time and somebody that she's going to trust, a therapist that she's going to trust. And I think it certainly needs somebody that has experience with adolescent issues and trauma and sex addiction as well. Those are a lot of different specialties rolled up into one. But this is a serious situation. I really put a high priority on getting the right help for this young woman, and that maybe trauma therapy ultimately, but I think it also may be just understanding kind of where she's at in terms of validation, and who she believes herself to be, what she's looking for, and just kind of give her some stability, because this is a really worrisome situation.
Yeah. I mean, Marnie Ferree, Ferree in Nashville. I believe she treats adolescents and as well as sex addiction. So Marnie Ferree, Ferree, she's in Nashville. If she can't take you, she can probably point you to somebody. Because if your daughter, your partner's daughter was older, these would be very much sex and love addict behaviors in a female. It's hard to tell with adolescents. This is, I totally agree with David. You can't treat adolescents like you would treat an adult, because there's just too much other stuff going on that a straight up adult sex addiction therapist probably is not in tune with. So yeah,
but like words like frighteningly narcissistic and lying and all that's, I mean, those are real warning signs to me.
Yeah, those are total addict behaviors, and just warning signs even beyond addiction. It's
right.
just
sure.
It's going to cause problems. Can you give a quick debrief on what mother enmeshment looks like? If you don't mind, David, I'll just give a quick debrief.
Go ahead.
Mother enmeshment. There's a book called Silently Seduced by Dr. Ken Adams, ADAMS, Silently Seduced. Give it a read. But basically what it is a child is basically turned into a partner by one of the parents. In my family, my father, workaholic, alcoholic, just nice man, but not there. Never abusive, but just not there. And certainly not emotionally there. So my mother made me her little husband. And it's a form of abuse. And what David was talking about earlier, thinking no big T trauma, mother enmeshment is a whole string of little T trauma, heaped on little T trauma, heaped on little T. It just goes on forever. And there is a sexualized element to it, even if there is never any physical contact, which usually there isn't. But there's a sexualized element commenting on the body, the developing body, or, how handsome they are, or how pretty they are, whatever. And basically the child is used to meet the need. Usually the son is used to meet the needs of the mother, the emotional needs of the mother. And that's just backwards from what a healthy parent-child dynamic is. A quick debrief. Any additions to that, David?
No, that's a great, concise definition. I think, just certain things I've seen, and you're right, often not physically at all, but people just, a mother sharing details of her sex life with her husband, with her son or daughter, or the father with the daughter, just inappropriate, lack of boundaries, icky, what Dr. Robin called icky.
Yeah, and that's the technical term that Dr. Ken Adams uses too, is the relationship feels icky to the son or the daughter, more than the parent. The parent will deny that they've done anything wrong. So yeah, tune in next Thursday, 11:05 with John Taylor, because you're going to want to be there for that one. My sex addict has asked for validation for his progress, etc. and isn't familiar with asking for validation from others, I guess meaning others than the betrayed partner here. As a betrayed partner, I'm not always able to validate him authentically, understandable, which upsets him. Is self-validation the first step, or is there a precursor to finding the peace that you described for a sex addict? So interesting question. And betrayed partners are often, confronted by the sex addict who wants validation for the hard work they're doing. And the betrayed partner's not ready to give it. And I tell guys in my work groups, and I know we tell them it's like, you need validation external, don't go to your partner. She's too mad at you right now. She doesn't trust you right now. Probably not the best source for external validation. Okay, I'm rambling. Your turn, David.
No, I mean, I totally agree. I think it's not really the job of the betrayed partner at all to do this, and it puts them in a terrible spot because it kind of denies their ability to feel anger and their process, right? They're doing their own healing, and to interrupt that to soothe the addict, it just doesn't make sense. I think also in general, it's nice to have spouses who can validate each other, but I think in general, I don't think that's the primary job of a spouse. I think we're there to support. We're also there to be realistic and be helpful and say, gee, I think you could improve here, or you did this well. But I don't think we want to transfer that external validation to the spouse, and that's where we stop. That's not okay either. I think it really has to go all the way into that internal validation piece. And I guess the first step there would be seeking healthier validation from other people besides the spouse, right? The sponsor, the therapist, the peers, and getting feedback in that regard while they're building their capacity to be able to do it themselves. But I think it's really unfair. And by the way, it's okay for you, the partner, to say, no, this is not okay. I'm not able to do this right now, nor do I think I should do this right now. And that may be something that happens in the context of a couples session or something. But I think, yeah, that's an unhealthy demand to me. And we often hear this because, and understandably, the sex addicts are kind of riddled with guilt and shame and want to move forward. And seriously, I think most of them have really good intentions, especially when they leave treatment. They really want to do this. They believe they're doing it. They want their partners to see how hard they're trying. The problem is that takes a long time. The partner, because of the betrayal trauma, is unable to see that, and nor should they have to see that right away. I mean, it's an unfair demand on the part of the addict, and so we try to correct that as it comes up. But I think it's an issue that we do see. But I think generally, moving toward the step, if there is one, would be getting good validation from other people besides the spouse that are healthier, like a therapist or a peers or a sponsor or somebody like that.
Yeah, I remember when I first started going to 12-step meetings, the old timers would say, my job is to love you until you can love yourself. And I would think, that's creepy, because I'm just not even ready to receive that. Right. But years later, I understand, what they were saying is, I'll validate you while you work on building your self-esteem. You need a pat on the back, come to me, I will pat you on the back. And I tell guys, if you need a pat on the back, come to me, I'll pat you on the back. Don't ask your spouse for the pat on the back. She's not willing to give it to you right now. Right. She won't be able to, this is wonderfully put. I'm not always able to validate authentically. You are very in tune with your feelings, and I congratulate you on that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Totally. Yeah.
Okay, next one here. I'm a male recovering sex addict and recovered for just about 2 years. I've been an addict for most of my life, and through my recovery, I have begun to realize and remember that my mother constantly gave me positive affirmations and constantly built my ego regarding relationships and life success. As I went through life, I realized none of this was coming true or happening, and I believe these affirmations influenced my addiction. Is this possible or worth for further therapeutic exploration? That's a very interesting question. So, too much positive affirmation from mommy, and not being able to live up to it. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I think this is a dynamic that I've certainly seen before, where people, often mothers, I think, overly inflate perhaps the validation and expectations And this really sets up the kid for a reality check at some point in their lives where the actual, development may not match the high expectations people had. And so I think in many ways the parent is not doing anybody a favor when they're doing that, because they're really setting unrealistic expectations and unrealistic expectations about how the world operates. Just like we, as parents, I think, want to protect kids and we don't want to have them, suffer needlessly, of course, but we also have to kind of, I think, help them learn skills that'll help them deal with the world, because the workplace may not be as comfortable as a cozy home growing up, or the world in general, I think, can be a little harsher, a lot more harsher, and I think kids need to be prepared for all of that. So it's almost to artificially kind of inflate the ego doesn't do much good. I think that's definitely, if you're in therapy, this is a rich area to pursue, because there's all kinds of messaging that goes on, both overtly in the words that were said, but also covertly, just like incest, we have overt and covert. But I think just, what's the meaning, what's the implication, what's the expectation, and what's the result, what's the impact? And so you may have to do some kind of corrective work on that. But in any case, I think just in terms of gaining insight into you and your family dynamics, it should be, as our friend Karen, the therapist at Seeking Therapy, says, there's a lot of meat on that bone. So you could do some good work there.
Yeah. And, I since we've mentioned enmeshment a couple of times, this almost feels like one of the ways that parents can be enmeshed, which is
right on the border, if not.
It's all about me. If you're great, then I must be a perfect parent. And that's kind of how I went through my childhood, was if I did well, my mother made it all about her. And if she talked me up, it was about her wanting to look good or feel good about herself. I was used for her to meet her needs. So that could be a dynamic here that's worth exploring, or it just could be, some other dynamic. But I agree with David. Lots of meat on that bone.
Right.
Okay, next one. I'm a betrayed partner. I can now see that my CPSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, has had an impact on my reactions to the betrayal from my sex addict. I can see that this added to the current trauma. I now see that the path forward for me is looking at me, my trauma, and healing outside of what is happening with my spouse. Is the only way forward for my healing stepping away from my relationship? I see many therapists that are ex-partners of sex addicts. I am just curious. Thank you. So this is somebody with unresolved childhood trauma that has resulted in PTSD. Complex PTSD is another term for layered trauma. In addition to being betrayed in her current relationship. And she wants to know if she needs to step away from the current relationship if she's going to heal.
I think sometimes it's safe to say that the choices we make before recovery, before therapy, sometimes are different than the choices we make afterwards, right? And so very often our past informs who we get involved with in a relationship. That said, I don't necessarily believe it's necessary to step away from the relationship to do the healing. I do agree that with what you said, the course of that healing, or the process of that healing, is a lot of self-work and internal work for you. And then that requires space. It requires emotional space. This is where, for example, if I were your therapist, I might recommend a therapeutic separation, for example, where you're not terminating the relationship, you're not necessarily even moving out. You'll have therapeutic separation in the same house, but they're just not, spending time all the time together. But what that does is gives you the physical space to focus on you without the distraction of a very busy relationship and a healing relationship. Can the work be done in the context of staying in a relationship? Absolutely, in my opinion. I think it might be slower, a little messier, a little more complicated, just because it's not as clean, because things get blurry and emotions and situations arise and things like that. However, I think you can hold your space and do the work you need to do. When we have complex trauma like this, and this is something we often see, by the way, with betrayed partners who have complex trauma in their own history. And so when they get involved with a sex addict who cheats on them, or has other kinds of betrayals, it falls into a long line of other existing pain and wounds and betrayals they've already experienced, and it magnifies them on. And the problem with complex trauma is everything kind of comes awake again, alive. That all just adds to it and builds. So it's a serious situation. I don't mean to say it's not, but I don't think it's a necessity for you to have to get out of the relationship. What I would recommend, depending on the nature of your relationship, and I don't know anything about that really, but how much interference would there be? How much white noise or other kinds of noise would there be from the relationship if you're trying to do this work? And that can require simply concentration and alone time. If you have a partner who's needy, for example, that might get in the way, right? But I think if you can work out a deal with your partner where you can have the gift of space and time to work on this, I think you ultimately it'll heal a relationship in a much stronger way. Because in my experience as a trauma therapist, when we can start to resolve, I'm an EMDR therapist, and we talk about channels of trauma, right? The traumas kind of collect, and the amazing and beautiful thing about some trauma therapy like EMDR is that if you can correct one of those, they kind of all start to get corrected, right? They all resolve in a way. So you don't have to do each specific trauma one by one. You can kind of, they cluster in a way that makes healing more efficient to our benefit. So anyway, my point here is that, yeah, it's serious work. There requires concentration, but I don't think you have to make dramatic changes in your life. And I think ultimately it could really benefit your relationship for sure.
I did not know that about the channels and the clustering. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's very cool. Really cool.
Yeah. Okay, this next question is from a sex addict, porn addict. For how long are slips and relapses normal, and how often is normal? Interesting question.
I'd like your take on this, Scott, too. So, I mean, slips and relapses, I think they're certainly more common in the beginning. I think they're somewhat to be expected, although I don't want to, I don't want to open the door and just say go for it. But
they're not mandatory.
They're not mandatory. Like, thank you. It's a great way to put it. But they happen, right? They do. And I think the important thing is, what do we do with them? And I think the important thing is always to do kind of a postmortem on them and see, what can I learn from this unfortunate situation, to not have to do it again. And because I know in my own recovery, until I learned a lesson, I would keep making a mistake until I really learned it. How long? I think the frequency dies down. I don't know that we're ever given a free pass to say no more slips, right? I think it can happen anytime, years into recovery. I think the chances of that diminish greatly, but I think there's a kind of a downward frequency of things. But Scott, what do you have to say about that? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think it's sort of the backside of a bell curve, the likelihood of slips and relapses diminishes over time as long as we're working a good program. If we stop working a good program or think, okay, I got it, then it's going to be the front end of the bell curve. It's gonna climb right back up. Just the big thing is, slips and relapses are not mandatory. They do tend to happen. And when they happen, if and when they happen, we need to learn from them. And David just hit that right on the head. And spoiler alert for the guys at the treatment center, you're going to be doing an autopsy of a relapse tomorrow with me. So right on point. Okay, next one here. My sex addict husband wants me to flirt with and explore sexual experiences with other men. I think most of his interest in that comes from the addiction and his personal experiences, but he's wanted that for me for 14 years now. He says he doesn't see that changing, and I feel hurt by it. Is this common in sex addict men, and does the interest abate over time? He's doing his recovery stuff, but we still have a long way to go. Okay, so is that a common interest, and does it abate over time? Is it related to sex addiction? Is it related to something else?
We do see this sometimes with sex addicts who will encourage their partners to do things like this, flirt with other men, sometimes actually have sex with other men, or have threesomes, whatever. Just, it's a way of, I think, trying to minimize the bad feelings and guilt and shame they probably have about this, to kind of bring their partner into their behaviors. I don't think it's ever a healthy thing to do. I think there's a lot of pressure in the course of active addiction to do this. I think when we start to see this in recovery, I worry, because this to me is very definitely addict behavior. It's behavior from an intimacy and healthy sexuality point of view that's way out of bounds. It's not good for the relationship. And I know from a sex positive point of view, people organize themselves in different ways, but somebody that's been touched by sex addiction, I think really loses the option for some of those more variable ways people interact. And I think we have to kind of keep it pretty straight-laced, if you will, too. I don't think this is a healthy behavior at all. And I think you're right to kind of feel uncomfortable with this. It's, to me, in the past, when I've seen this, it's a way of, with sex addicts, trying to normalize their behavior by pulling their wife into it. And I don't think it's healthy. So 14 years is a long time. I think this is part of his arousal template. Obviously, there's something in his arousal template that is drawing him toward this behavior. It's a fantasy. It's some aspect of that. What we know from arousal template elements is that they often don't change or go away. So he may have had this for 14 years, and he may have it the rest of his life. The thing is, what does he do with that? And all of us have a lot of fantasies in our heads that we need to kind of hopefully let go dormant, but certainly not act out on. And I think this would be one of those. And he may have to address what that's about. But I certainly think to continue to kind of push you to do it is out of bounds. And I think it's unhealthy for probably both of you. So that's my take on that. And I would definitely, this is something, if you guys are in therapy, I think you said a CSAT. Yeah. This is something he could bring up with his CSAT, or if you guys have joint sessions, you might bring it up yourself with the CSAT. I think a therapist would have a pretty good perspective on this, hopefully. But I don't see it as a healthy behavior at all.
It feels like, the way it's being described, that it's part of the addiction, and he's trying to pull you in as a way of justifying the behavior. And I do want to add a couple things. Number one, you and no person should ever feel obligated to engage in sexual activity that they're not comfortable with, period. If you don't want to do this, you don't do this. And if it's not his choice to make, it's yours. You don't want to do it, don't do it. You want to feel hurt by it, by all means feel hurt by it. I want to validate that feeling. I would probably feel hurt by it too, if I was in that situation. I agree with David that it's probably embedded in his arousal template. It's not going anywhere. He has a choice about whether he wants to act on it or not. He has a choice about whether he wants to push you to do it or not. Just like you have a choice to say no if you don't want to do it. This does not mean that sex addiction sobriety is, only in the missionary position with your legally married wife. This is not how we define sexual sobriety. If you have a kink or a fetish, that can be incorporated into sexual sobriety. It just needs to be done with extreme caution and mutual consent, and you're not violating relationship boundaries, and you're not doing it compulsively. What you're describing feels compulsive, and it's certainly violating your relationship boundary. So this would not be an acceptable sober behavior for somebody that I was working with. And I think David obviously made that point clear too. But, sex doesn't have to be boring, or totally vanilla in recovery. It just needs to be non-compulsive and not causing you or anyone else problems, either physically or mentally or emotionally. You know, consenting adults can do what they want, as long as there's no manipulation. And I would think you might be feeling a little manipulated. He might be trying to manipulate you into doing something that you are not comfortable with. And that's not a good behavior for a sex addict. That's an addict behavior. I agree with David.
Absolutely. You know, if I could put in a shameless self-plug here, I'm doing a work group starting the 16th of January. It's a week from Monday, on healthy intimacy skills for men in recovery. It's a 6-week work group that I'm teaching myself, followed by healthy sexuality for men in recovery. And we cover a lot of these kinds of things. So it might be something to look at. You can look at seekingintegrity.com under work groups, and the information about the work group is there. But it might be, this is the kind of stuff we talk about. So
yeah,
be good.
Yeah, highly recommended. Starts January 16th, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, you just and it's called Healthy Intimacy and Sexuality. There's a level 1, which is focused on intimacy, and a level 2, which is focused on more on sexuality. And we do it in that order for a reason. Because without healthy intimacy, you're probably not going to have healthy relational sex. Okay, one last question here. I've just had a month off from work. I'm going back at the end of the week. I'm trying to write down boundaries for myself in terms of how I interact with women and seek intensity. Any suggestions on how to map this out? I assume these boundaries are work boundaries, but any thoughts on that, David?
Oh yeah, I think, you know, the topic tonight, validation, right? Validation seeking. I think a lot of times guys seek validation from women in the workplace, and we can see problems with that when it gets into supervisor relationships, right? Really crossing boundaries, and a lot of guys get in trouble for that. I would just really kind of be aware of how boundaries have been in the past for you, what you need to work on, what your points are. I don't know if you have a spouse, but oftentimes spouses have opinions about how to re-engage in the workplace. And I've had guys do everything from, you know, keeping the door open in the office if they're meeting with a woman, to not traveling to conferences with women, or whatever. There's different ways of approaching this. But I think I applaud your proactive stance here. And I can't recommend specifics. Maybe Scott, you can. I think looking at the validation, looking at what will keep you comfortable and well in your sobriety plan, I guess, is the bottom line.
Yeah, I believe this individual is one of our regular attendees and is in a relationship, I believe. And I'm sorry if I'm wrong, but if you are, I would use your partner's filter instead of your own. You know, put your partner on your shoulder like the little good angel that's whispering in your ear and says,
right,
no, I'm not comfortable with this. And if the little angel on your shoulder is not comfortable with it, don't do it. So
that's a really great tool, by the way, to say, okay, if I had my partner right here listening to this whole thing, what would they think? And that's a beautiful guide. Yeah.
So, okay, we're out of time. I'll save our questions that we didn't get to for next week. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Happy 2023. David, lovely to see you as always. Anything you want to say to take us out?
No, just try to shift toward that internal validation. It's a much better way to live. So thanks, Scott. And
all right, thanks, everybody. We'll be back next week.
Bye-bye.